Pacific. Next, Murray Polner and Jim O'Grady talk about their book, Disarmed and Dangerous, The Radical Lives and Times of Daniel and Philip Berrigan. Murray Polner is a journalist and editor who has written for several publications, including the New York Times, The Nation, and the Washington Monthly. Jim O'Grady is also a journalist and author of a biography of social activist Dorothy Day. They spoke at the Brookline Booksmith in Brookline, Massachusetts.
Good evening, and welcome to Brookline Booksmith. Hi. It's a pleasure to see you all here this evening, and we thank you, as always, for continued support of your locally owned independent bookstore and our reading series. Tonight, we are pleased to be hosting Murray Polner and Jim O'Grady, authors of the recently released and well-received biography, Disarmed and Dangerous, The Radical Lives and Times of Daniel and Philip Berrigan, Brothers in Religious Faith and Civil Disobedience. A stunningly original work which explores how the Berrigan brothers came to be the most famous religious political rebels in recent memory, as well as key activists in the civil rights and anti-war movements of the 60s, and highlights their continued activism in recent decades. Both authors hail from New York City, where Murray Polner has been an editor and writer for various publications, including the New York Times, The Village Voice, The Nation, and many others. He is the author of No Victory Parades, The Return of the Vietnam Veteran. His co-author, Jim O'Grady, is a journalist and author of the biography Dorothy Day, With Love for the Poor. Disarmed and Dangerous is a real lyrical and insightful work which contributes not only to the details of history, but more importantly to the understanding of the figures who made them happen. Please help me welcome Murray Polner and Jim O'Grady.
The man that's leaving was the best boss I ever had in my whole life.
As I understand it, we have to both stand here, right? And share the microphone.
All right. Hold on, Jim.
That's the way it goes.
Want to start?
Okay. Okay, all right. How's this? All right, since we wrote a stunningly original book, I'd like to ask a stunningly original question. How many people here, well, vividly remember the Berrigans from the 60s? But from first-hand experience, from being perhaps politically active adults in the 1960s and reading and hearing about them. So about half the crowd. Oh, no, more than that. And was your impression positive or not? Positive. So most of the crowd here was opposed to the Vietnam War, I take it. Okay. Well, that's just a little ideological test we like to make.
He's planning to give a short answer quiz after this.
Yeah, yeah. Where should we begin? Maybe we can do a quick synopsis. We can take turns. Murray had the idea of writing this book longer ago than we like to remember. It was probably about 5 years ago. It was a long process. Murray vividly remembers the Berrigans. Murray, as he tells it, wanted their contributions to the political life of America remembered and indeed discussed and debated beyond the Berrigans' relatively brief time of fame in the late 60s, early 70s, when you could see them on the cover of Time magazine. Maybe you remember seeing them on the cover of Time magazine, which was a very big deal back then. And when they really had a national following. So we were introduced by a mutual friend, and Murray being a Jewish author and me being a Catholic one, we thought the synergy might work to our advantage. Yeah, anywhere you like, actually. And so 5 years later, we have a book. What also drew us to the Berrigans is that they've had long lives. Daniel is 75 going on 76, and Phil is 73 going on 74. They've had epic lives. They've packed an incredible amount of activity and accomplishment into their lives, which makes them perfect subjects for a biography. And finally, they are complex, well-rounded characters. At times, they've acted in incredibly heroic ways. and have made a serious contribution to American democracy and to many things, to religion in America, to the idea of civil disobedience in theory and in practice in this country. At the same time, they're also flawed human beings. They also have turned people off. They also have been too thin-skinned when it came to criticism. They also are the products of a very difficult upbringing. They come out of a family that had flaws and strengths just like any other family. So all of this contributes to make them really fascinating characters. And that, I guess, is my introductory speech as to why we chose them. Now, we've been doing radio interviews, and we're so used to passing these things on and off. So why don't I let you say what you want?
We've been doing so many interviews. Most of them are just 3-second sound bites. It's like, describe, describe X, Y, Z, and we just barely get through it. The question that is always asked is, why the Berrigans? When we first tried to publish the book, or I was trying to get before Jim became my collaborator and co-author, we tried to sell the idea, I tried to sell the idea to any number of publishers, and often they would say, one, who cares about the 60s anymore? Who cares about the Vietnam War anymore? Who cares about, and who are the Berrigans? And I said to myself, well, I should be writing about sex and celebrities and gossip and Newt Gingrich, and people like that, and Clinton and the Chinese connection. I was very interested. I was very moved, for example, when I was during the 60s when I was writing about combat veterans, working class and lower middle income kids who were in Vietnam. And I wrote another one on kids who deserted or went to Sweden and Canada and France and Italy and so forth, and many hiding here in the States. And I felt something was missing, and what was missing was the religious component. And I was deeply moved, for example, by Rabbi Abraham Heschel, Joshua Heschel, and would go to read everything he wrote, and would go to the Jewish Theological Seminary and anywhere else that I could hear that he was speaking, and got to know his daughter and so forth and so on, who was as much a scholar as her father was. Turns out that Heschel and Berrigan were very close friends, and I began to wonder about the religious anti-war movement. We knew there was a pro-war movement. We knew there was a movement that I don't have any opinion, and we certainly knew there was a secular anti-war movement. But I wanted to know what moved people. And we began to focus in on the religious anti-war movement. And when we speak of the Berrigans, of course, we speak, because the biography is about these two brothers, but we speak of lots of other people who joined them in a variety of different ways. And the so-called Catholic left, which is kind of a meaningless term in many ways, and probably Francis Duplessis Gray's description, the ultra-resistance, is best. And that's why when I went to look for someone to help, I knew that I needed somebody who knew much more than I did about Catholicism, and I thought was a very good writer, because Jim had written about Dorothy Day and was active in such things as the Catholic Worker, and especially Pax Christi. And so a mutual friend who had worked for me and with me brought us together, and she said, I'm sure you'll like him. And in between, to my heart, I said, I know I won't. And then we got to know each other, and I like him.
Thank you, Murray Polner. Murray's very good when we do these interviews at placing the Berrigans in the context, in the historical context of civil disobedience in America. It starts with, say, Thoreau. Well, the Berrigans would say it starts with Jeremiah smashing the clay tablets in the temple in protest of his King's War policy, and Christ in the temple throwing out the tax collectors and turning over tables. But in the American vein, it's the abolitionists against slavery. It's William Lloyd Garrison burning a copy of the U.S. Constitution, the USS Constitution. I'm sure there's a ship that Phil has boarded by that name and done a plowshares action. There's Thoreau. Then after that, there's the Civil Rights Movement. And the Civil Rights Movement added a twist. The Civil Rights Movement were working toward political ends through moral means, but had a lot of people who were religiously motivated, and it came out of the black churches. And this was kind of a twist on American civil disobedience. And this woke the Berrigans up, just like it did the rest of the country, to the power of civil disobedience, to, I guess the Berrigans would call it redemptive suffering, and the moral suasion that can come with that, to alerting an entire nation to an injustice, like segregation in the South. The Berrigans did another thing, I would contend. What they added to civil disobedience during the anti-Vietnam War was, and now this is their sort of theology, they turned the act of civil disobedience into a religious ritual itself. In their mind, there's no difference between what they do and what, say, goes on in a church. These plowshares actions that come directly out of their burning draft files during the Vietnam War are named for the biblical injunction from Isaiah to beat swords into plowshares. And this is what they try literally to do. It also is sort of, if I can make this clear, it's a bit in the ancient Christian tradition of subverting pagan gods. And Dan and Phil Berrigan fiercely believe that nuclear weapons in particular, and the security that comes from war and war-making and preparations for war, is a kind of religion, not only in this country, but they live in this country. And they would say it's part of the religion, it's a particularly American mania, this religion of security through weapons of overkill. So they go into the temple, onto the ship, onto the base, where these quote-unquote holy objects are housed. They go up to them, and they sort of anoint them with blood, which is a symbolic way of communicating the blood and the waste of war. And they also take, and I think for me, the key moment is they take a household hammer. They make their living as house painters and doing odd jobs. And they take this ordinary instrument, this mundane, banal instrument that's used to build and create, and they hit the nuclear component or the nuclear warship. And in that moment, they would contend that they turn an object of destruction into an act of creation, much like you do when you convert a sword into a plowshare. And for them, Phil Berrigan literally experiences God in those moments. And for me, that's also a key point. As odd and as strange and as bizarre and as difficult as that sounds, this is how he has chosen to communicate his objection to nuclear weapons and war, etc. This is the language, the moral language he has chosen to speak in. And because it's so important to his spiritual life, it's really his spiritual bread, as much as going to churches or synagogue to other practicing religious folk. That's why he will never quit. And that's why at age 73, he's in jail right now with 5 other people for having done another one of these plowshares acts, excuse me, on Ash Wednesday in February at the Bath Iron Works, as one of our guests in Maine, will describe to you a little more later. But that's my understanding of the basic theology behind what the Berrigans do.
Well, you know, we wrote this book, and it isn't easy writing a book like this. We interviewed about 250 people. We worked in the Berrigan archives. I called John Schuchard many times to explain technical things, because I have a problem putting a plug in a wall and getting it straight. Several things were very interesting. We did it chronologically, of course. We started somewhere back in Ireland, and we moved up to period. One of the things that interested me, 2 things. One was that much of the book, of course, is centered in the Vietnam era. The 60s was certainly a significant part of our lives and has shaped it. I always remember at the time of the Gulf War, President Bush said that, I'll paraphrase it, he said something like, once the war was, he said, this will end the Vietnam syndrome and those guys like the Berrigan brothers. Bush said that, something of that effect. There will be revisionists, and I don't say that pejoratively. There will be people that will look differently. Perhaps Lyndon Johnson's decision-making will look differently. Perhaps the landing of Marines at Pleiku will look differently. Perhaps the killing of 1 to 2 million Southeast Asians will look differently. Perhaps the 58,000 Americans that died will look differently to the future. To us, it remains as an evil, murderous war. When I speak about this to one of my dear friends, he starts screaming, "It was evil, it was evil." I said, "Stop, you're not in a religious, in a religious building. I believe you." And you see this, and I've seen recent books attempt to alter this, and they were not alone. I don't think that they themselves, by any means, or even the secular anti-war people such as yourselves, ended the war. But I often ask myself, and because not until the centrists decided that the war was not worth a candle did the war finally come to an end. On the other hand, I ask myself, centering on the Berrigans, somewhere in the book towards the end, we write, well, what if they didn't say anything? What if they remained closeted in their buildings or in their homes or in their retreats? What might have happened? Well, any number of things that had there not been a massive anti-war movement, which to me is a great lesson for the Generation X and or even younger people should we decide to go to war again in some unholy cause. The second thing that struck me about the Berrigans, was the fact that I look around. I was talking to my very good friend. We were together in the afternoon. We talked about so many things that we believed in. In fact, I proudly call it the liberal welfare state in many ways, is vanishing before our eyes, under challenge since the early 1980s, not only here but perhaps throughout the world. The glorification of the free market and unfettered capitalism and the like. And we see in our own country the most prominent people, most notably in Washington and elsewhere, the rise of demagogues, which we've always had, but again, the re-rise of demagogues and cynics, the avaricious. And what struck me at the very end as we were talking, Jim and I would discuss how we might close the book. What struck us was what the Berrigans did, and they still do, was and the people that are around them. I hate to leave those people out. There are many people who perform just as nobly as they, and just as bravely as they, and just as wisely as they. They asked subversive questions. And what were the subversive questions? They had a moral and an ethical coding. And how many of our, well-known people ask these moral questions about how we deal with the impoverished and the most vulnerable and people at risk, and this right here at home. They ask questions about race. Phil himself was very much taught for years in New Orleans, was very active in the civil rights movement, even before Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King. And they ask questions about where we're going in terms of foreign policy and war. And some of the people have said to me, well, nuclear bombs are not the major problem today. Maybe they're not. Conventional weapons are just as dangerous and just as destructive, perhaps. On the other hand, I hear no questions being raised by columnists, opinion makers, editorial writers. I'm sure there are some about the moral or ethical drift, and the silence. And I honored them for not being silent. We honored them. Yeah.
The Bush quote that I remember is during the Persian Gulf War. Maybe you remember this. I think it was, yeah, Phil Berrigan and a few of his friends hopped the White House fence, and they went to some fountain on the lawn there, and they poured a little blood in the fountain. And it was funny. It came a week after the National Council of Catholic Bishops, the official spokes body for the Catholic Church in America, analyzed the impending Persian Gulf War and found that it might not meet all just war criteria, which means what? Nothing. It might not. Well, does it or doesn't it? But they made this analysis, and they delivered it to the president, and President Bush thanked them a great deal, knowing that, you know, they did him a favor. And a week later, Phil Berrigan and his friends did this, and Bush said, you know, he thanked the Catholic bishops, but he said, you know, I just don't find those guys like Daniel and Philip Berrigan very helpful. Well, and that's exactly what the Berrigans want. They want not to be helpful to George Bush and whoever when he's about to prosecute the Persian Gulf War or what have you. That's the Berrigans, and in a way, they don't really deal with the details of foreign policy. They don't get into the nuts and bolts of poverty programs and social justice. They speak very broadly, and for that reason, they madden not only George Bush, they also madden, you know, liberals and others. But they see themselves in this prophetic role of saying no, and of in season and out of season, giving compelling witness to nonviolent resolution of conflict, which they base on biblical principles. And this makes them strange and unpopular, but it also, if you see them as speaking from a prophetic tradition, it makes them a unique voice in our American democracy, and I think we also agree for that, a valuable voice. So eventually we'll ask you questions.
Yeah. You know, when you do a book like this too, you get all sorts of different voices and different people. I found, you know, Cardinal Spellman, a fascinating character. I found J. Edgar Hoover, a fascinating character, you know, and when I read the biography, several recent biographies of him, and saw some film in, I forget who played, I shuddered. You know, here was a man with such extraordinary power. You find modest heroes. You found, who was the congressman from Tennessee? Anderson. John Anderson had been a nuclear commander of something, submarines, who remembers? And he was a congressman from rural Tennessee. And there was a guy named Tim Buck or Tom Buck. I don't think he's alive anymore. I called every Tom Buck in Maryland and Washington and kept getting people hanging up or saying it's the wrong one. And I tried to find him, but he introduced him to mostly to Dan Berrigan's writings. Dan is extremely eloquent writer and poet. And he went to visit him in Danbury Federal Penitentiary, a medium security penitentiary. And he then denounced J. Edgar Hoover on the floor of Congress. He was the only congressman ever to do it. And then what Hoover did, and this is in the Haldeman diary, no, one of the Nixon books about Nixon's brilliant statements that have come out on tape. He then spread word and spread it through the House. He sent around that Anderson was consorting with women of ill repute in Memphis. You know, he made up stories. There were a lot of other fascinating characters, and people did a great many. Number of the people who participated one way or another. The most controversial chapter is probably not the various trials. It's probably Berrigan's whole to-do over the question of Israel. And in 1973, he was then teaching at the University of Winnipeg, or at the university in Winnipeg. That may not be the actual thing. He was teaching a course in religion, and he was invited to speak before a group he had never heard of, the American Association of Arab University Graduates, something like that. And he wrote the speech, and rather than show it to Arthur Waskow, who was down in Washington at the Institute for Policy Studies, it showed it instead to Ekbal, Iqbal Ahmad, yeah. And so he began by his speech very quickly by saying, I'm a pacifist, and someone in the back said, oh, shit, and he walked out. Another one of those creeps. And then he blasted the Arab states for a variety of well-justified sins, and then he blasted Israel for a variety of well-justified sins in many ways, because he saw the Palestinians as victims, but he didn't see the nuance, and he didn't see the ambiguities. He only saw a certain absolute picture in our judgment. Paul Mayer, who was very close to him, was born Jewish and was a refugee from the Nazis and became a Catholic monk, and the Lord knows what he is now, had many relatives in Israel. And Paul got him, they went on a joint trip to Israel, to Syria, to Lebanon, maybe to Egypt, I don't remember. And Dan saw much more complexity. In fact, he denounced Arafat and Hawatmar and Habash, certain extremist leaders, particularly Hawatmar and Habash, because they had killed a great number of Jewish children in Malat, and then he denounced the Israelis for a retaliatory air raid and so forth. But it wasn't the black and white issue of Vietnam. It was a kind of a muddied issue. But he never changed, and he came back, and he still says, I have a letter that he just wrote to a friend of his, he sees the Palestinians as victims. They don't have the weapons, and he still has great sympathy for all victims. And so that was it was what made it so controversial, and it was wild, was that he was bitterly denounced by his erstwhile Jewish liberal and left-wing friends. And one person called him, unfortunately, a religious anti-Semite, which he never was and never will be. He was deeply hurt by it. And I think he still is to some extent. And we try to track that whole thing. And I can't tell you, unless you knew it, hundreds of articles appeared in every conceivable magazine. Writers like Paul Jacobs, if you remember the name, questioned him. Writers like Rabbi Everett Gendler, if you know the name, at Packet Mance, questioned him, and so forth and so on and so on. He appeared on public television with Hans Morgenthau, who was an ally of his, and yet they tried to explain. So it was, not just a momentary turmoil. And one Jewish writer once said, he wrote for secular papers, I'll paraphrase it, if that schmuck ever gets in trouble again, let him go to his Christian friends. I mean, that's how bitter it became. And so we try to deal with that. And then we carry the story into contemporary periods. Jim can talk about the Plowshares movement, which was which was Phil Berrigan's brainchild, and I guess John Shushaw too, to a certain extent.
It wasn't my idea.
No. And particularly the most interesting of all of them, which was seems to me was the GE, where was it in Pennsylvania?
The first one?
Yeah, where was it? What? King of Prussia, Pennsylvania. Jim?
Well, I think we covered Plowshares. I would just add on the Israel's speech, what was Daniel Berrigan said the controversy was so hot that for a while, he wrote in a letter to a friend, I replaced God in prime pulpit time. But it was a bad speech. It was too sweeping. It was overgeneralized. It reflected his great inexperience in the issue. But it also grew out of an interesting side of him in that he likes to tweak his people who would be his allies. He likes to, in the early 60s, he toured South Africa, and he was just broken apart by the injustice and the cruelty of that state. At the same time, when he would meet with anti-apartheid leaders, he would say to them, well, listen, maybe you should consider doing more. Maybe you should consider marching in the streets, risking your lives. That's what they did in our South, and it caused a great deal of resentment and controversy. When he ministers to AIDS patients in New York City, which he does to this day, many of them gay men, he says to them, well, listen, you've lived a vastly materialistic life up to this point. Maybe you should take this occasion to reflect and simplify your life. This is not an easy thing for a person to hear, but he likes to challenge even his friends. He, during the late 60s, early 70s, when someone would throw an event supporting his famous protests against the war, he would say to the room who's gathered to honor him, look, you all are doing nothing. This is meaningless, what you've done here tonight, gathering here together. Go out there and get arrested. And more than one person told us they would leave the room saying, well, screw you, Daniel Berrigan. But it's part of that tendentiousness. In a way, it's a weakness, but it's also a strength. He doesn't back off from many confrontations, even though he's not an aggressive person, personally. But it's what he considers part of the prophetic role. You don't just denounce easy targets. You try to speak the truth to whatever audience you're in front of. And I think that was part of what went into his Israel speech as well.
Yeah, it went into the Israel speech. It was, as we say, a sweeping generalization based upon inexperience. He learned a great deal, I think, from his trip to Israel. And he never preached nonviolence when he was in Israel or the Middle East, because the questions were even more difficult to resolve, as we see today, certainly, more difficult to resolve than a mere war in Southeast Asia. We carry the story more or less to the end, and then we raise the issue by saying, we conclude by sort of saying that we think of them with all their flaws, with all their inability or lack of desire to build institutions for social change and political change. One wonders what will happen after they pass from this earth, who will follow them, who will have their significance, who will remember them. On the other hand, we look at them and we think of them as very much genuine American heroes, far more than the transparent and one-dimensional people who we tend to lionize in these years. And we found the experience of writing about these two people very worthwhile and very enriching. And we saw the warts, we saw the wonderful things that were done, and we tried to put it all in the context of what was happening in the United States in those tempestuous years.
Questions?
Any comments or questions?
I think you've got one sentence in the book about their anti-abortion work. They're both, as I understand, anti-abortion. Dan has been arrested for picketing Planned Parenthood clinics, at least, I believe. Could you give us some more details as to the nature of their opposition to abortion, what they have done, what they would like to see legally written into law, protecting the unborn? Take it from there.
Well, you know, I don't think they would particularly write laws, and they're not interested in those things. They speak out of, they speak two ways. They speak out of the Catholic tradition, religious tradition of opposition to abortion. You'll never find, you'll very rarely find them in one of the more angry anti-abortion demonstrations. They speak out of, what's the name of the organization? The like a seamless web, seamless garment thing, which is opposition, which is to be seen among certain Catholic church people and Catholic lay people, opposition to all kinds of violence, opposition to war, opposition to capital punishment, and opposition to abortion. And while many of us may not agree with that, that is certainly on the question of abortion, this is the framework in which they operate, and both of them have operated.
Yeah, they're not your classic liberals. They take nonviolence as the starting point, and they just believe that abortion involves violence to a human being. So therefore they're opposed to it.
Tell me who they've turned off specifically on that topic.
Legions of women, many feminists, even many left-wing Catholics.
The archives, the Berrigan archives, which were very helpful to us at Cornell University, which we had full access to, has a number of furious letters from women who had been involved apparently in the anti-war movement and so forth, and believed in many of the things that the Berrigans were doing, and were, especially Dan Berrigan, and were terribly exercised at their support of their opposition to abortion. So there is a lot of it. It reflects the population, and those who are those who are very much in favor of abortion and those who are very much against will be caught in this argument. And
Have they done anything lately on that?
I don't know, really.
I don't think so. Dan writes about it occasionally. Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, their time spent in prison, and I take it there was a considerable amount of time. Do they tend to keep to themselves? Do they have a lot of interaction with other inmates? How was their time spent in prison?
Prison stinks. Prison is violent, noisy, disruptive. It's for the large part unremitting suffering. Prison is hard. Daniel Berrigan almost died from a botched surgical procedure in the early 70s. They spent a large part of their time struggling just to keep their spirits up. That's the first thing I think that has to be said about their prison experience. It is not romantic at all. They don't go there and get close to God and read catch up on their reading, you know. But, well, yeah, you just said they do. Well, yeah. But it's not exactly a leisurely great books course when you're reading in prison. At the same time, they do make constructive use. It's part of the attraction of nonviolent civil disobedience to them is to be among the oppressed, they would say, at the low end of the totem pole in this society. They make friends. They make enduring friendships that last outside prison. They have worked to reform prison rules and particular institutions. Yeah, so they write lots of letters.
I once taught in a prison, and I've been a rabbi, an acting rabbi. I'm not a rabbi, but I've conducted Jewish services in a maximum security prison in New York State, and I must tell you that it wasn't scary for me, but if I were in there, I would be scared. It's not a picnic. However, Phil spent hard time with others in Lewisburg Federal Penitentiary. And, there's more than a curtain. It's an iron curtain between what we know about what goes on in prisons and what we don't want to know and what we're not permitted to know. On the other hand, Dan was in a medium security prison in Danbury, in Connecticut here, and Phil was transferred there after a while, and this was very good for both of them. They were even given the right to conduct sort of a great books course with other inmates, and the books they selected were incredibly subversive, but they were the star prisoners, but it always was difficult. And one of our people we interviewed was Dan's teaching assistant in the University of Winnipeg, and when he got there was a strike, and Dan, of course, wouldn't teach courses at the university when the maintenance people and the clerical people were striking, so they went to this teaching assistant's apartment where they held classes, and then Dan would tell them who was surveying, which the the police were outside, and he would give them information and so forth, and tell them about that in a humorous way. But in a serious way, then the assistant said they would drive to the prisons, and he would feel enormous sympathy for a great many of these people who had been convicted. And in one of the drives, he told them how he was nearly killed and nearly died from a fatal dental surgery that was botched. But there's nothing. I remember during the Vietnam War and after, young people would say when we were draft counseling, "Oh, so I'll go to prison," and I would get so upset because it's not a picnic, and we know that especially for males it's particularly difficult because immediately they're potential rape victims in many cases and worse. So and Phil has spent approximately about 7.5 years in prison, and as Jim says, he's prepared to do it over and again. Dan doesn't really go to prison anymore, and he's 70, he's got 75, going on 76 next month, and that's a little bit advanced.
So from now on, if anyone ever asks us about prisons, we'll just have to say they teach and read the great books. That'll be our
It
shorter
wasn't
answer.
quite the great books, but they were great books with a small g.
I'm wondering what you would most want to come out of your book. If you let yourself dream grandiose dreams.
New York Times #1 bestseller.
Well, I don't mean just the publicity. I mean its effect on people or the culture or bigger than that.
Well, that you know, that a controversy ensues, that people get riled up about the Berrigan's philosophy of life and politics, and that people argue about it. I think they would want that too, but certainly that their ideas have a life because of our book, some kind of life.
Well, I read, you know, like a lot of people's New York Times. After I get through with the obituary and sport pages, I read the rest of the paper, and I get very angry. I mean, I read that we're the largest seller of weapons throughout the world. I read that we're now going to arm Latin American states who are obviously endangered by somebody, most likely themselves and their own police forces. You know, and so I would hope, you know, I would certainly hope that that these questions, again, these ethical questions that simply say, what the hell are we doing? I read all of these things. I read Bob Herbert, who I admire enormously, who's the only columnist writing consistently about social justice, about what's happening to people at home who are in desperate straits. And I would say, would somebody please say something? Would you cease being silent? I like to read Anthony Lewis, and I say, would somebody say something and stop being silent? And if I had to say anything, I wish people would speak up again. What are they afraid of? What can they do to us? And this is something that troubles me enormously, and that's what I wish. Of course, it won't happen, but I wish it might happen. One of the nicest things that was said about the book was in the San Francisco Chronicle, in a lengthy review, and he said in the end, at least after this book, the Berrigans and the questions and the things they raise, the issues they raise, will never, and their colleagues, will never be a footnote in history. And that I liked, Yes.
I'm wondering what the influence of Catholic World War II pacifists and Dorothy Day, since you wrote something on that, had, if any, on their move forward and their progression of taking action.
That you can be a pacifist and a Catholic at the same time. This shocking revelation that Dorothy Day lived, and that Gordon Zahn and others embodied by being some of the very few conscientious objectors during World War II. Clearly the Berrigans saw a tradition in that, a noble one, that they were themselves trying to extend. And Dorothy Day was a mentor to them. Gordon Zahn was an invaluable source to them on the history of Catholic doctrine and teaching. So they were examples and precedents and friends, I think you'd have to say. Is that enough? Okay. Yes.
First, this isn't why I raised my hand, but if it does become #1, Murray, and they make a movie out of it, it seems to me De Niro and Duvall, I think, played two priests in a movie called True Confessions.
It was a very good film.
So that's my suggestion for
Well, it's great.
for the casting. What I wanted to ask, I seem to remember, which maybe I may remember wrong, so you'll let me know, that at some point Dan Berrigan, on orders from whoever you have, from the Pope or from Rome, wherever you get orders from as a priest, simply ceased some aspect of his ministry. I don't know if he was it involved coming back from a foreign country, I think in Latin America maybe. So Drynan did this when he was serving in Congress, and he was forbidden to do it, so he stopped serving in Congress. So I'm curious, in his mind, Dan Berrigan's mind, or in yours, which obviously may be two different answers, and one of you is also a Catholic, did it compromise his vocation to be willing in the end, as somebody who was a CO who was fighting against the militaristic principle, you obey orders regardless of conscience, that in the end he would obey orders, religious authority orders, regardless of his own sense of vocation.
Yeah, that's interesting. Okay. You can't defy every order, I think he would say. If you look at Dan Berrigan's career as a Catholic priest, he defied many orders from his excuse me, Jesuit superiors, from the Archdiocese of New York. I don't know if the slightly, in one minor occasion, the Vatican itself. A lot of people who have heard of the Berrigans say to us, Daniel Berrigan, when did they kick him out of the priesthood? Well, they didn't. 50 years later, he's still a priest. He's still a Jesuit priest. This is his life. And but the point is, they asked that question because he came so close so many times to being kicked out. During the 60s, Cardinal Spellman forbade him from saying anything about a young boy who just tragically immolated himself outside the United Nations in protest of the Vietnam War. Daniel did anyway, and that's how he got his 4-month vacation in Central and South America. So he did it on large points. There were minor points. At that same time, however, he was always experimenting with liturgies. He was way ahead of his time. He was facing the congregation. He was having informal liturgies in his apartment. He was doing all kinds of groovy things, but not just dilettantish 60s things. But people were very moved by his experimentation in liturgy. He was told to cut it out, and he did. So in that instance, yeah. I think that's the short answer, yeah.
Any other questions? Yes.
We owe you a debt for great work.
Would you stand up?
Yeah.
You and talk, right?
Yeah, my name is Barry Roth. This is John Schuchard. John was in the Plowshares Aid and King of Prussia. I was in the Aegis Plowshares Easter Sunday of '91, and we're both supporting Phil and others who are, again, in jail now, facing trial for Plowshares and Ash Wednesday. The point that is so important is that the work of Phil and Dan and the community continues. It's not a footnote in history. What is different is the context and the culture and the wholesale buying out of most of the media. We know a Boston Globe senior writer who watched the Six enter the Bath Iron Works shipyard on the day of the action. And the piece in the Boston Globe was about a paragraph deep in the local section. So your work is important in countering the culture of death, the culture of the corporation, the culture that the Berrigans lead us to oppose. It's important, but we need to make the point that the work is going on, and that's perhaps in some ways the most important part of the story. I was visiting Susan Crane, one of the Six, yesterday in the Cumberland County Jail in Portland. They will be going to trial in Portland, Maine, federal court, Monday, the 5th of May. The charges are conspiracy and destruction of property, threatening up to 15 years prison, $500,000 fines. So the important thing is to know that the work continues, the people continue, the hope continues, life, choosing life instead of choosing death.
Well, Deuteronomy is a good quote, at this point. Choose life. Yes.
I would ask these two gentlemen, what kind of support are they looking for?
Well, thank you for the question, and thank you for your writing. I'm happy to meet you tonight. I'd like to echo some of the things that Barry said, and perhaps most of you know but on Saturday night, Dr. George Wald died. And he I think, we must look to as one of the great men of wisdom of the 20th century, of our time, and a voice. And of course, a very close friend of Dan and Phil, and without hesitation went down to appear as a witness in our trial for the entry of the GE nuclear weapons factory. I mention that because I feel what Barry says is the crisis not only continues, it deepens. One of the last words on Dr. Wald's lips was survival. The environmental collapse, the moral collapse, the social collapse, the fact that prisons are the second industry to war now is no accident. That in Massachusetts they're trying to bring back executions. It's a grave moment, and that Phil, as a survivor of a combat veteran of the Second World War, that good war, that war that hangs over America to persuade us of the righteousness of war, and other survivors of the Second World War, like Howard Zinn, you know that we need to hear these voices. And in this neighborhood, these are voices that we know face to face. I imagine most of you know face to face. And at 76 years old or 74 years old, to board an Aegis that not only was under maximum security by the military contractor, but had already been taken command of by the United States Navy and had a full complement of officers and sailors on board, and take hammers to the Tomahawk nuclear missile launchers, pour blood on the bridge, on the command center, the navigational center, shows, I think, that there is something on the side of these prophets that we could all be listening for. What they're asking is, you know, what each of us, how each of us can respond. What can we do? Not just to support them. They wouldn't say, we don't need support. But what can we do where we are with what we know and with what we see? I think that's really, it's a very profound, and it's that uncomfortable question that doesn't let anybody off the hook in any way. But to feel the pain, to feel the crisis, to feel what would take somebody into the face of a prosecutorial system and a judicial system that is part and parcel of the war-making machinery. You know, to realize that Dr. Wald, a Nobel laureate, was not allowed to testify in a court of law, you know, is to understand the corruption of our judicial system. We are supposed to have an independent judiciary. They are not supposed to be the handmaiden of the Pentagon. They are supposed to study Nuremberg and the U.S. Constitution and the Hague and the Geneva Conventions and be an independent judiciary and listen to that kind of evidence. Listen to Admiral LaRocque, who's a survivor of Pearl Harbor. Listen to Daniel Ellsberg, who reviewed all the nuclear warfighting plans of this country, not rule them out of order. And that's what's going to happen to them up in Maine. They're going to be before a judiciary that does not want to hear the law, does not want to hear expert witnesses. And to go in to court knowing that that's what you're facing is a real challenge. Certainly I know, to me, I feel very challenged by this. They're facing 15 years in prison. They're under federal guidelines, which takes all discretion away from the judge. They look down a matrix. It's like a computer printout, the number of convictions, the gravity of the offense. These are double felonies, and the sentence is spit out at the end. So there is, at the trial, as Barry said, is on May 4th.
May 5th.
I hope May 5th. There'll be a gathering the night before on May 4th. I hope people that can will be there or will be informed. Of course, there's a whiteout in the press. This is not considered news. Who's interested in it? Why should it be interesting that you can board an Aegis cruiser filled with the most god-awful destructive capacity, the ability to wipe out a continent? Why should anybody be interested in that? A survivor of the Second World War? Do we support our troops? Do we care for our veterans? You know, let him be buried in a prison and forgotten by the American people. That is where we are at this moment. And I hope that whatever you can do, don't let that happen.
Well, I'd just like to say a few practical things. You can buy this book and read it, get it for all your friends. Dan and Phil have written autobiographies. There's also a book on the Plowshares movement. John and I can get you these details. You can write to the papers in Boston. You can write to the papers in Portland and in Bath. You can write to the prisoners in jail. You can visit them. And
The Cumberland County Jail.
Cumberland County Jail. If you want, you can. We can give you this data. Sunday the 4th, there is to be a Festival of Hope, which is a celebration before the trial, gathering friends in support and in celebration and facing the trial. Trial is Monday. There is planned civil disobedience in Portland or Bath Tuesday. And regarding the civil disobedience, I would urge you, if you're interested, to go and be there and support. You may be moved to join, you may not, but if you read books like this, you realize that even the Berrigans didn't get there all in one step. It was a process of growth and evolution. So by all means, buy the book and come.
Amen.
Any other comments or questions?
May I assume that among the issues they dealt with, abortion is not one that you are both in sympathy with? You are opposed to their position on abortion? May I correctly
You're asking
assume
our
that?
positions on abortion?
I'm sure.
Is that what you're asking?
Yeah.
I'm in favor of abortion, certainly when I believe it is up to the woman to decide.
So you're opposed to their activities on that topic?
Oh, no question.
Yeah,
But
both
I
of you.
Didn't think it was central to the book, but I think it's into their lives.
I think that's fascinating that you only developed one sentence on the entire topic. Did you deliberately avoid this because of your personal opposition to them on that point?
You want to give your position?
My position about abortion, I think, is not important. Because Daniel Berrigan has done one action at an abortion clinic. Because it's among their range of issues, it's not one of their priorities.
And I don't recall ever even reading anything, I'm sure he's against it, reading anything by Phil Berrigan, except perhaps maybe, just maybe, and I'm not even sure, he may have signed one of the seamless garment advertisements. You know, people do lots of things in their lives and take various positions, but when you write a biography, you have to have a certain selectivity. There's a certain priority. We consider the author. I mean, we must decide as authors what's most important. And we decide, in this case, what was most important. We didn't neglect it, but we didn't think it was something worth going deeply into it, because they're not central figures in this, in the issue of abortion or against abortion. And so we didn't particularly feel that it was that necessary.
We've got time now, and thank you so much.
Okay.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you.